The morning of my wedding was supposed to be perfect. I had imagined it countless times during my deployments, those quiet moments between missions when I'd close my eyes and picture walking down the aisle in a dress that made me feel beautiful. I never expected to wake up at 2 a.m. to the sound of scissors cutting through silk. My name is Commander Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 12 years serving my country in the United States Navy. I've been deployed to 3 different continents, earned 2 Bronze Stars, and worked my way up to a position most people only dream about. But none of that preparation could have readied me for what my own family would do the night before I was supposed to marry the love of my life. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a ruined wedding dress. It's about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you most try to tear you down at your most vulnerable moment. It's about standing up when everything inside you wants to crumble. And it's about discovering that sometimes the uniform you wear with pride can become the armor you never knew you needed. 3 days before the wedding, I had driven home to Pennsylvania from my station in Norfolk. The autumn air was crisp, leaves turning gold and crimson along the highway. I was excited to see my family, to share this milestone with the people who had raised me. My parents had seemed distant over the phone lately, but I chalked it up to wedding stress. Everyone knows weddings can make people act strange. My childhood bedroom still looked exactly the same as when I left for the Naval Academy 15 years earlier. Pink wallpaper with tiny roses, a white desk where I used to do homework, and photographs of high school friends thumbtacked to a corkboard. But now it also held 4 garment bags hanging carefully from the closet door, 4 wedding dresses, each one more beautiful than the last. I know what you're thinking. 4 dresses? Who needs 4 wedding dresses? The truth is, I couldn't decide. After years of wearing nothing but uniforms, the idea of choosing something feminine and elegant felt overwhelming. My fiancé David had encouraged me to get whichever ones I loved, telling me we could return the others after I made my final choice. One was classic satin with pearl buttons running down the back. Another was vintage lace that reminded me of my grandmother's photos from the 1940s. The third was simple and modern, clean lines that felt sophisticated. The fourth was a ball gown that made me feel like a princess, even though I'd never been the princess type. Each dress represented a different version of myself, a different way I might step into this new chapter of my life. I had planned to try them all on one more time the morning of the wedding, to see which one felt right in that moment. That evening we had a quiet family dinner. Nothing fancy, just my parents, my younger brother Kevin, and me sitting around the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals growing up. The conversation felt stilted, though. My mother kept glancing at my father with an expression I couldn't read. My brother seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly. My father barely looked at me at all. I tried to fill the awkward silences by talking about the ceremony, about how excited I was to finally marry David after dating him for 4 years. I mentioned how grateful I was that everyone could be there, how much it meant to me to have my family's support as I started this new phase of my life. My father grunted occasionally. My mother nodded politely. Kevin said nothing. The atmosphere felt heavy, like storm clouds gathering before thunder breaks. But I pushed those feelings aside. This was my family. These were the people who had cheered when I graduated from the academy, who had sent care packages during my deployments, who had always been proud of my service. At least I thought they had been. After dinner, I went upstairs early. The next day would be busy with hair and makeup appointments, last-minute preparations, and the ceremony itself. I wanted to get plenty of rest so I would look and feel my best. I kissed each of my parents goodnight, hugged Kevin, and headed to my room. Before getting ready for bed, I unzipped each garment bag just to peek at the dresses one more time. They hung there like possibilities, each one gorgeous in its own way. I imagined David's face when he saw me walking down the aisle, imagined how it would feel to finally be his wife after waiting through long deployments and months apart. I fell asleep easily, exhausted from the drive and the emotional weight of the day. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke to sounds that didn't belong. Soft footsteps in the hallway, the creak of my bedroom door opening, whispered voices that stopped abruptly when I stirred. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I smelled something sharp and metallic in the air. My eyes snapped open, and I saw shadows moving near my closet. 3 figures huddled around the garment bags, and in the dim light filtering through my bedroom window, I caught the glint of scissors. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to stay perfectly still. Through barely opened eyes, I watched in horror as my own family systematically destroyed every single one of my wedding dresses. The scissors made soft snipping sounds as they cut through fabric that had cost months of savings. Beads and sequins scattered across the hardwood floor like fallen stars. My mother held each dress steady while my father cut. Kevin stood watch by the door, making sure I didn't wake up. They worked methodically, almost professionally, as if they had planned this destruction down to the last detail. No hesitation, no second thoughts, no mercy for the dreams those dresses represented. When they finished, they gathered up the pieces and stuffed them back into the garment bags, zipping them closed, as if nothing had happened. Then they crept out of my room as quietly as they had entered, leaving me alone with the sound of my own thundering heartbeat and the sick feeling rising in my throat. I lay there in the darkness for what felt like hours, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My own parents had sabotaged my wedding. My own brother had helped them. The people who were supposed to protect me, to celebrate with me, to want my happiness above all else, had instead chosen to destroy the most important day of my life. Questions raced through my mind faster than I could answer them. Why would they do this? What had I done wrong? How could they hate me so much that they would sneak into my room like thieves in the night to ruin something that meant everything to me? As dawn began to break outside my window, I finally forced myself to get up and face the damage. With shaking hands, I unzipped the first garment bag. The satin dress had been cut cleanly in half at the waist, the pearl buttons scattered across the bottom of the bag. The vintage lace dress was in ribbons, delicate patterns destroyed beyond any hope of repair. The modern dress had been slashed diagonally from shoulder to hem. The ball gown looked like it had been attacked by wild animals, tulle and silk hanging in tattered strips. 4 dresses, 4 possibilities, 4 versions of the bride I might have been. All of them destroyed in a matter of minutes by the people who were supposed to love me most. I sank to the floor among the ruins of my wedding dreams, and for the first time since I was a child, I cried. Not the quiet tears of disappointment or frustration I had learned to shed in private during difficult deployments. These were the deep, body-shaking sobs of someone whose heart had been broken by betrayal so profound it defied understanding. But as I sat there surrounded by destroyed silk and shattered dreams, something else began to grow alongside the grief. Something harder and stronger and more determined than anything I had felt before. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and stood up slowly. The destroyed fabric crunched under my feet like broken promises. My chest felt hollow, but my mind was starting to clear. I had been through worse than this. I had navigated hostile waters, made life or death decisions under pressure, and earned the respect of sailors who initially doubted whether a woman belonged on their ship. I wasn't going to let 3 people who shared my DNA break me now. Walking to my closet, I pushed aside old clothes and forgotten boxes until I found what I was looking for. In the very back, wrapped in protective plastic, hung my dress white uniform, the one I wore for special ceremonies, for moments that required dignity and honor. The fabric was crisp, the gold buttons polished to perfection, every ribbon and medal precisely placed according to regulation. I pulled the uniform out and laid it across my bed. 2 silver stars gleamed on the shoulder boards, each one representing years of dedication, sacrifice, and achievement. These weren't just decorations. They were proof of who I had become, despite growing up in a house where my accomplishments were met with silence or resentment. My phone buzzed. A text from David asking if I was excited about today, if I was ready to become his wife. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back that I loved him and would see him at the altar. I didn't tell him what had happened. Not yet. This was something I needed to handle myself first. By 6 a.m, I could hear movement downstairs. Coffee brewing, breakfast dishes clattering, the normal sounds of my family starting their day. They probably thought I was still asleep, still unaware of what they had done. They probably expected me to discover the destroyed dresses later, to break down crying, maybe even to cancel the wedding entirely. I showered and began the careful process of putting on my uniform. Each piece had its place, its purpose. The white jacket with its precise tailoring, the black belt with its gleaming buckle, the white skirt that fell exactly to regulation length, the black shoes polished to mirror brightness. Every ribbon told a story of service, of missions completed, of lives protected. When I pinned the 2 stars to my collar, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about wearing a uniform to my wedding. This was about showing up as exactly who I was, without apology or explanation. For too many years I had downplayed my achievements around my family, sensing their discomfort with my success. I had made myself smaller to make them feel bigger. Not today. I checked myself in the mirror one final time. The woman looking back at me wasn't a victim. She wasn't someone who could be broken by petty cruelty or family dysfunction. She was a naval officer who had earned every thread of gold braid on her sleeves, every ribbon on her chest, every star on her collar. Downstairs, I could hear my family moving around the kitchen. Normal Saturday morning sounds. My mother was probably making pancakes, something she did every weekend when I was growing up. My father was likely reading the newspaper, complaining about politics or the weather. Kevin was probably still in his pajamas, scrolling through his phone. They had no idea what was coming. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate and measured. The hardwood creaked under my regulation shoes, and I heard the kitchen conversation stop abruptly. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, complete silence had fallen over the house. I turned the corner into the kitchen and saw all 3 of them frozen in place. My mother stood at the stove with a spatula in her hand, her mouth slightly open. My father had lowered his newspaper and was staring at me over his reading glasses. Kevin had actually put down his phone and was gaping like he'd never seen me before. None of them spoke. They just stared at my uniform, at the ribbons and medals they had never bothered to ask about, at the 2 silver stars that marked me as a senior officer in the United States Navy. I walked to the coffee pot and poured myself a cup, taking my time. The silence stretched and stretched until it felt like a living thing in the room. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "Sarah," he said, and his voice sounded strange, uncertain. "Why are you wearing that?" I turned to face him, coffee mug in my hands, and spoke in the calm, measured tone I used when addressing subordinates who had made serious errors in judgment. "My wedding dresses seem to have been damaged," I said. "All 4 of them. Cut to pieces, actually, so I decided to wear this instead." My mother's face went pale. The spatula trembled in her hand. Kevin looked down at the table, suddenly fascinated by the wood grain pattern. "I don't know what you're talking about," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't you?" I asked, raising one eyebrow. "Because I was awake when it happened. I watched the whole thing, all 3 of you, working together like some kind of special operations team. Very thorough job, by the way. Very complete destruction." The color drained from my father's face. My mother made a small choked sound and set down the spatula with shaking hands. "We thought," my mother began, then stopped. She looked at my father desperately, as if he might provide words she couldn't find. "You thought what?" I asked, my voice still perfectly calm. "That destroying my wedding dresses would somehow hurt me? That it would make me small enough for you to understand? That it would remind me of my place in this family?" Kevin finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. Not of me exactly, but of the consequences of what they had done, of the reckoning that was clearly coming. "We didn't mean," he started. "Yes, you did," I interrupted. "This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment. You planned this. You coordinated it. You executed it with military precision." I paused, letting that last phrase sink in. Too bad you never learned what real military precision actually looks like. I set down my coffee mug and straightened my jacket. Every movement was controlled, professional, deliberate. "I have a wedding to attend," I announced. "My wedding. And I'll be wearing this uniform because it represents something you've never understood about me. It represents honor, sacrifice, dedication, and achievement. It represents the woman I became in spite of this family, not because of it." My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his voice rising. "You can't talk to us like that. We're your family. We raised you. We sacrificed for you." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had never once asked about my deployments, never inquired about my duties, never shown even the slightest interest in the career that had become my life's work. "No," I said quietly. "You housed me and fed me and sent me to school. But you never raised me to be proud of who I am. You never sacrificed anything for my dreams or my happiness. And you certainly never acted like family last night when you snuck into my room to destroy something that meant everything to me." The kitchen fell silent again. Outside, I could hear birds singing, cars starting up as neighbors began their Saturday routines. Normal sounds of a normal morning in a normal suburban neighborhood. But nothing about this morning was normal anymore. "I'm leaving now," I said. "I'm going to marry David, and I'm going to start my new life with someone who actually loves and respects me. You can come to the wedding if you want. You can sit in the pew and watch me walk down that aisle wearing this uniform that represents everything you tried to tear down. Or you can stay here and think about what you've done." I turned to walk away, but my father's voice stopped me. "You think you're better than us," he said. His tone was bitter, angry. "You think that uniform makes you special, makes you superior." I turned back slowly, and when I spoke, my voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded ships and led sailors through dangerous waters. "I don't think I'm better than you," I said. "I know I'm different from you. I know I chose a path that required courage, integrity, and selflessness. I know I've earned every single decoration on this uniform through hard work and dedication. And I know that when I look at myself in the mirror, I see someone worth respecting." I walked out of that kitchen with my head held high, leaving behind 3 people who suddenly looked smaller than I had ever seen them. The drive to the church gave me time to think, to process what had just happened, to prepare myself for what was coming next. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my heart was pounding with a mixture of anger, hurt, and something else, something that felt like freedom. The parking lot at St. Mary's was already filling up when I arrived. Cars I recognized from childhood, neighbors and family friends who had known me since I was a little girl playing dress-up in my mother's clothes. They had no idea what they were about to witness. No one did, except for David, who I had called on the drive over to explain what had happened. His reaction had been immediate and fierce. "They did what?" he had said, his voice tight with disbelief and rage. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, we can postpone, we can reschedule, whatever you need." But I had told him no, we weren't postponing anything. We weren't letting 3 people's cruelty derail the most important day of our lives. I was walking down that aisle today, in my dress whites, and I was marrying him exactly as planned. When I stepped out of my car, conversations stopped. People turned to stare, their faces shifting from confusion to recognition to something approaching awe. Mrs. Henderson from next door actually gasped out loud. "Sarah? Oh my goodness, is that really you?" I had grown up in this town, but most of these people had only ever seen me as the shy girl who lived down the street, the one who went away to college and then disappeared into the military. They knew I was in the Navy, but they had no idea what that really meant. They had no concept of what those ribbons represented, what those stars signified. The whispers started immediately. "Look at all those medals. Are those real?" I had no idea she was so important. 2 stars? What does that mean? She's not even 35 and she's wearing 2 stars. I walked through the parking lot with the same measured pace I used on deck during formal inspections. Every step was deliberate, every movement controlled. The morning sun caught the gold braid on my sleeves, the shine of my buttons, the gleam of my ribbons. I looked exactly like what I was, a naval officer who had earned her place through merit, dedication, and sacrifice. Inside the church, the murmur of conversation died the moment I appeared in the doorway. The sanctuary was nearly full, decorated with white roses and baby's breath, exactly as we had planned. David stood at the altar with his groomsmen, all of them wearing traditional black tuxedos. When he saw me, his face lit up with the kind of smile that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. But it wasn't David's reaction that mattered most in that moment. It was everyone else's. The congregation turned in their seats to look at me, and I watched understanding dawn on their faces. This wasn't just Sarah from down the street wearing a costume. This was Commander Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy, standing in full dress uniform with decorations that spoke of years of distinguished service. My parents' section was near the front, and I could see them huddled together, whispering frantically. My mother's face was red and blotchy, like she had been crying. My father looked stunned, as if he was seeing me for the first time. Kevin sat between them, slumped down in his seat like he was trying to disappear. But the real reaction came from the veterans in the congregation. There were several of them, older men who had served in Vietnam or Korea, who understood exactly what they were looking at. One by one, they stood up, not because anyone told them to, not because it was part of the ceremony, but out of instinctive respect for the uniform and what it represented. Mr. Patterson from 3 houses down was the first. He had served in the Marines during Vietnam, and when he saw my ribbons, he rose to his feet slowly, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. Then Mr. Rodriguez, who had been a Navy corpsman in Korea, then Mr. Williams, who had done 3 tours in Vietnam as an Army medic. The sight of these old warriors standing in respect caused a ripple effect throughout the congregation. People who had never served, who didn't understand the significance of what they were seeing, stood up anyway because they recognized the solemnity of the moment. They might not have known what my ribbons meant, but they could see the reverence on the faces of those who did. I walked down the aisle alone, just as I had planned from the beginning. My father was supposed to escort me, but after what had happened that morning, I wouldn't have accepted his arm even if he had offered it. This was my walk to take, my moment to claim, my declaration of independence from a family that had never understood or appreciated who I had become. Each step echoed in the hushed sanctuary. The only sound was the soft rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, and the muted whisper of my uniform against itself. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, on David's face, on the altar where we would exchange vows, on the future we were building together. But I was aware of everything else, too. The sharp intake of breath from my Aunt Carol when she got a close look at my ribbons, the whispered "Good Lord" from someone in the back. The way my mother's shoulders shook as I passed their pew, whether from crying or anger, I couldn't tell and didn't care. When I reached the altar, David took my hands gently, careful not to wrinkle my uniform or disturb the precise arrangement of my decorations. He leaned close and whispered, "You are magnificent." His voice was thick with emotion, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. Father McKenna, who had known me since I was a child in Sunday school, looked momentarily flustered. He had clearly not been prepared for the bride to appear in military dress whites, but he recovered quickly. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of David and Sarah." But before he could continue, a voice from the congregation interrupted him. "Excuse me, Father." It was Mr. Patterson, the Marine veteran. He was still standing, his back ramrod straight despite his 70-something years. With respect, Father, I think we need to acknowledge what we're seeing here. That young woman is wearing the uniform of the United States Navy with decorations that represent distinguished service to our country. I think we owe her a moment of recognition. Father McKenna nodded slowly. Of course. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have Commander Sarah Mitchell with us today, not just as a bride, but as a distinguished officer in the United States Navy. The applause started softly, scattered clapping from various parts of the congregation. But it built quickly, growing stronger and more sustained as people began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a moment of recognition, a celebration of service and sacrifice that most of them had never seen up close. I stood at attention, as I had been trained to do when receiving honors. My back was straight, my chin up, my hands at my sides. The applause washed over me like a wave, carrying with it years of unacknowledged achievement, decades of service that my own family had never bothered to understand or appreciate. When the applause finally died down, I turned slightly to look back at the congregation, at all these people who had known me as a child but were seeing me as an adult for the first time. My eyes found my parents' pew, and I saw my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. My father was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Kevin looked like he wanted to crawl under the pew and hide. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary without need for amplification. "It's an honor to serve, and it's an honor to be here with all of you today." Father McKenna cleared his throat gently. "Shall we continue with the ceremony?" I turned back to David, who was looking at me with such pride and love that I felt my chest tighten with emotion. "Yes," I said. "Let's continue." As Father McKenna began the traditional wedding liturgy, I was acutely aware of the weight of my uniform, of the ribbons and medals that told the story of my career, of the 2 stars on my collar that represented years of hard work and dedication. I had earned every thread of gold braid, every piece of metal, every decoration that adorned my chest. My parents had tried to strip away my dignity, to reduce me to nothing more than a disappointing daughter who had failed to live up to their expectations. But standing there in my dress whites, surrounded by people who could finally see me for who I really was, I realized that their opinion of me mattered less than I had ever imagined. The ceremony continued with the traditional exchange of rings, the recitation of vows that David and I had written ourselves. When it came time for me to speak, I looked into his eyes and said the words that came straight from my heart. "David, you have seen me at my strongest and my weakest, in uniform and out of it, on shore and at sea. You have loved me, not because of what I've accomplished, but because of who I am when all the decorations are put away and it's just you and me. Today I promise to bring that same person to our marriage every day, to be your partner in everything we face, to stand with you as we build a life together." When Father McKenna pronounced us husband and wife, the kiss we shared was sweet and tender and full of promise. The congregation erupted in applause again, and this time I let myself smile, let myself feel the joy of the moment without reservation. As we walked back down the aisle together, I caught sight of my family one more time. My mother was crying openly now, but whether from joy or regret, I couldn't tell. My father sat with his hands folded in his lap, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Kevin was the only one who met my eyes, and in his expression, I saw something that might have been shame. Outside the church, the receiving line formed quickly. Person after person came up to congratulate us, but many of them wanted to talk about my uniform, about my service, about the decorations they had never seen up close. Mrs. Henderson asked about my ribbons. Mr. Patterson wanted to know about my deployments. Mrs. Rodriguez wondered how long I had been in the Navy. For the first time in my life, people in my hometown were seeing me as something more than just the girl who had left for college and never came back. They were seeing me as a naval officer who had served her country with distinction, who had earned her place through merit and dedication. My parents approached last, after most of the other guests had moved on to their cars. They stood a few feet away, uncertain, like they weren't sure if they were welcome to come closer. "Sarah," my mother said finally, her voice thick with tears. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I wasn't ready to forgive them, wasn't ready to pretend that what they had done was acceptable just because it had led to this moment of recognition. My father cleared his throat. "We didn't know," he said quietly, "about the uniform, about what it all means, about what you've accomplished." "You never asked," I replied simply. "In 12 years of service, you never once asked me about my career, my deployments, my responsibilities. You never wanted to know." He looked down at his hands. "We should have." "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of misunderstanding and resentment. Finally, my mother spoke again. "Can you ever forgive us?" she asked. "For last night, for all the times we didn't support you, for not understanding who you've become." I looked at them, these people who had raised me but had never really known me, who had tried to destroy my wedding out of jealousy or spite, or some twisted need to cut me down to size. They looked smaller now, diminished by their own actions and by the recognition I had received from everyone else. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Maybe someday, but not today. Today is about moving forward, about building a new life with someone who loves and respects me for exactly who I am." David squeezed my hand gently, a silent reminder that we had a reception to get to, guests to greet, a celebration to continue. I squeezed back, grateful for his presence, for his unwavering support, for the love that had never wavered even in the darkest moments. "We should go," I said to my parents. "We have a reception to host." They nodded, stepping back to let us pass. As David and I walked toward our car, I heard my mother say quietly, "She's so much more than we ever realized." "She always was," Kevin replied, his voice heavy with regret. "We just never bothered to look." The reception hall buzzed, with an energy I'd never felt before. White tablecloths stretched across round tables, each one decorated with centerpieces of white roses, and baby's breath that caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The room smelled of fresh flowers, and the faint aroma of the dinner being prepared in the kitchen. But something had shifted in the air itself. Conversations carried a different weight now. People weren't just talking about the weather or asking about the honeymoon. They were asking questions I'd never heard at family gatherings before. "Commander, how long have you been in the Navy?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she approached our table, her husband trailing behind with a proud smile. 12 years, I replied, adjusting my jacket slightly. The uniform still felt perfect, every crease sharp, every medal precisely placed. "And those ribbons?" She gestured toward my chest with genuine curiosity. "What do they represent?" I glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. For years, I had downplayed my achievements around my family's friends, sensing their discomfort or disinterest. But today felt different. Today felt like the truth deserved to be told. "This one is for my deployment to the Mediterranean," I began, touching each ribbon as I spoke. "This is for my service in the Persian Gulf. These are for various commendations and achievements over the years." Mr. Patterson leaned forward, his eyes focusing on the silver stars on my collar. "Commander, those stars, that's a significant rank for someone your age." "Yes, sir," I replied simply. "I've been fortunate to serve with excellent sailors and officers who've helped me grow in my career." The conversation flowed naturally from there, with genuine questions about my service, my responsibilities, the challenges I'd faced. It was the first time in my life that people from my hometown had shown real interest in understanding what I did, what my career meant, what I had accomplished. Across the room, I caught sight of my parents sitting at their assigned table. They weren't eating. They weren't talking to the other guests at their table. They were watching me, their faces a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully read. Shock, certainly. Regret, maybe. and something that might have been pride, though it was too little and too late to matter much. Kevin approached hesitantly during a lull in the conversation. He'd changed into a suit for the reception, but he looked uncomfortable, like the clothes didn't quite fit right. Or maybe it was the weight of what he'd done that didn't fit. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the gentle hum of conversation around us. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I looked at David, who nodded and squeezed my hand before moving to talk with some of his college friends. Kevin and I walked toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the clusters of guests. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, the words rushing out like he'd been holding them back all day. "I'm so sorry about last night. About the dresses. About everything." I studied his face. He looked younger than his 28 years, like the little brother I remembered from childhood, rather than the man who had helped destroy my wedding gowns just hours earlier. "Why?" I asked simply. "Why did you do it?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from when he was nervous as a kid. "Dad said you were getting too big for your britches. That you thought you were better than us because of your fancy job. He said someone needed to remind you where you came from." "And you agreed with that?" Kevin's face crumpled slightly. "I don't know, maybe. I was jealous, I guess. You left and did all these incredible things, and I stayed here and worked at the hardware store. When Dad talked about cutting you down to size, it felt like maybe you deserved it." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I'd expected excuses, justifications, blame shifting. Instead, he was giving me the raw truth, ugly as it was. "But seeing you today," he continued, gesturing toward my uniform, "seeing how everyone reacts to you, seeing what you've actually accomplished, I realize I never knew who my sister really was. I knew you were in the Navy, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know you were important." "I was always important," I said quietly. "You just chose not to see it." He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "I know that now. And I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, doesn't undo what we did. But I needed you to know that I see you now, really see you." Before I could respond, the band began playing the opening notes of our first dance. David appeared at my elbow, offering his arm with a gentle smile that told me he understood whatever conversation I'd been having could wait. As we moved to the center of the dance floor, the other guests formed a circle around us. The song was "At Last" by Etta James, and as David pulled me close, I felt some of the tension from the morning finally begin to ease. "How are you holding up?" he whispered as we swayed together. "Better than I expected," I answered honestly. "Different than I expected." "Any regrets about the uniform?" I looked around at the faces watching us dance, genuine smiles, respectful nods, eyes that saw me clearly for perhaps the first time. "None at all." When the song ended, Father McKenna approached with a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment." The room quieted, conversations trailing off as people turned toward the front of the hall. "I've known Sarah since she was 7 years old, sitting in the front pew during Sunday service," he began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. "I watched her grow up, watched her leave for the Naval Academy, watched her return home in uniform for various occasions over the years. But I'll admit, I never fully understood what her service meant, until today." He paused, looking directly at me. Seeing her stand at that altar in her dress whites, seeing the respect she commands from the veterans in our community, seeing the pride on her husband's face as he looks at her, I realize we've had a hero in our midst all along, we just weren't paying attention. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several people nodded, and I saw more than a few eyes dart toward my parents' table. "Sarah," Father McKenna continued, "would you mind sharing with us what your service has meant to you? I think we'd all benefit from hearing your perspective." I felt my chest tighten. Public speaking had never been my favorite part of being an officer, but it was part of the job. And today it felt important. Not for my ego, but for understanding. I took the microphone with steady hands and looked out at the assembled guests. Thank you, Father McKenna, and thank you all for being here today to celebrate with David and me. I paused, gathering my thoughts. Someone asked me earlier what my ribbons represent, and I told them about deployments and commendations. But that's just the surface. What they really represent is the honor of serving something bigger than myself. The room was completely silent now, every person focused on my words. They represent the privilege of working alongside some of the finest men and women this country has to offer. They represent sleepless nights, standing watch so others could sleep safely. They represent the weight of making decisions that affect the lives of the sailors under my command. I looked toward my parents' table, where my mother was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Most importantly, they represent the values I've tried to live by throughout my career. Honor, courage, and commitment, not just in uniform but in every aspect of my life. I handed the microphone back to Father McKenna, and the room erupted in applause again. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just polite wedding applause. This was recognition, understanding, respect. As the evening progressed, the dynamic in the room continued to shift. People who had known me as a child were seeing me with new eyes. Conversations at every table seemed to center around my service, my achievements, the significance of the uniform I wore. Mrs. Henderson stopped by our table during dinner. "Sarah, dear, I had no idea you were so accomplished. Your parents must be so proud." The comment hung in the air like a question mark. I glanced toward my parents' table, where they sat in uncomfortable silence, picking at their food. "That's something you'd have to ask them," I replied diplomatically. Later, during the cake cutting, my Aunt Carol pulled me aside. She was my mother's sister, but she'd always been the more direct one in the family. "Honey," she said, keeping her voice low, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. What happened this morning? Your mother's been crying on and off all day. Your father looks like he's seen a ghost, and Kevin won't make eye contact with anyone." I considered my response carefully. The truth was ugly, but it was the truth. "They destroyed my wedding dresses," I said simply. "All 4 of them, cut them to pieces in the middle of the night." Aunt Carol's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, disgust. "They did what?" she whispered, her voice tight with fury. "That's why I'm wearing this," I said, gesturing to my uniform. "It was the only appropriate thing I had left." She looked toward my parents' table, her jaw set in a way that reminded me of my mother when she was angry. "Those idiots, those absolute fools." "It's done," I said. "I can't change what happened. I can only control how I respond to it." "And this is how you chose to respond?" She gestured toward my uniform, toward the room full of people who were seeing me with new respect. "This is who I am," I replied. "It's who I've always been. They just never bothered to look." Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who understand you least. My parents tried to cut me down to size that night, but they only revealed how small their vision of me had always been. Standing there in my dress whites, surrounded by people who finally saw me for who I truly was, I realized that respect isn't something you inherit from family. It's something you earn through your choices, your service, your commitment to something greater than yourself. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt unseen by the people closest to you, remember this. Your worth isn't determined by those who refuse to see it. Sometimes you have to stand up and show the world exactly who you are, stars and all.